access to the Foundry blueprints. But I'll do my best to guide you there.
Sounds good. Mac, Seth, let's go.
It's fair to say that ReCore bears the burden of great expectations. Touted as one of Microsoft's big exclusives, and with legendary Mega Man game designer Keiji Inafune at the helm, it stood to head off the fall release calendar for Microsoft with a bang. Its mix of science fiction platforming, action combat, and cute robot companions could well have proved a big win for a platform that often seems outgunned when it comes to exclusives, and gamers had every reason to get their hopes up. Unfortunately, while ReCore does offer some joyous moments of action and platforming gameplay, its many faults and frustrations overshadow its successes. What begins as a colorful adventure across a new planet quickly collapses into rote repetition and mindless shooting. The player steps into the shoes of Jewel, a young woman who wakes alone on a desert planet called Far Eden. It's clear immediately that something is wrong. The planet was supposed to have been terraformed by the massive pylons that dominate the landscape, but that hasn't happened. Instead, they lie ruined across the sands. So she sets out into the desert with her robot dog companion Mac to try and figure out what happened. The game plays as a fairly straightforward third-person platformer. Jewel can double jump and also briefly dash in the air, allowing her to get between the many gravity-defying platforms that hang across the desert. Controls are tight and responsive, and the platforming elements are fundamentally solid. Jewel travels across a handful of large exterior desert areas, all of which are open to be explored. Scattered across these are numerous collectibles, as well as entrances to dungeons. The story takes Jewel to several story dungeons, but there are also a fair number of optional side dungeons. Some of these optional dungeons focus on platforming, some on combat, or some on a combination of the two. The player is rewarded at the end simply for finishing the dungeons, but extra rewards are available if the player completes certain side objectives, such as finding a secret key or completing the dungeons within a certain time limit. The primary collectibles here are the prismatic cores, a special resource that Jewel must obtain to unlock higher level side dungeons and to continue in the main story. These are hidden around both the outside desert world and the dungeons, and finding them is one of the primary objectives given to the player. Jewel also carries a gun, which she uses to take on the corrupted core bots that litter the landscape. She begins with only white ammunition, but as she progresses through the game, she unlocks the ability to shoot red, blue, or yellow ammunition. This is important as each enemy core bot is weak to only one or two colors. Jewel can also charge her shots, like Mega Man, to deliver a large blast that can take out enemy shields or deal a burst of damage. When an enemy gets low on health, Jewel has the option of attempting to tear out their core. Doing so begins a short tug-of-war sequence, and if successful, she kills the core bot immediately and obtains a resource called Fusion that can be used to power up her companions. Combat is fast-paced and initially quite fun. However, there's a distinct lack of variety to the enemies, and combat can quickly become repetitive. The color switching mechanic feels shallow, requiring nothing more than a button tap each time you target a new enemy. Combat can also be frustrating, as more powerful enemies often use moves that stun or deal ongoing damage to Jewel. In the later stages of the game, it often throws you against multiple such enemies in a small area, and it's quite easy for Jewel to be locked down by stun effects until she's dead. The camera angles don't help with this either, often obscuring new enemies that appear behind your back. The game uses a lock-on system, so you don't have to aim as you dash around, but this can often make it difficult to lock onto the target you want when there are numerous enemies on screen. I died more than once because I simply couldn't kill the main threat first. And if you do die, well, get ready for a long wait. The load times in ReCore are some of the worst I've ever seen. They're bad enough transitioning between outside zones, but when you die, it's often more than 2 minutes until you get to play again. In the later stages of the game where you're often unfairly thrown against hordes of enemies, this can be downright rage-inducing. At very least, Jewel doesn't have to fight alone. Over the course of the game, she gains access to 4 different companions. Outside of combat, each provides Jewel with a particular ability that allows her to access new areas or discover treasures. For example, Mac, the dog, can locate and dig up hidden loot, while the spider-like Seth can carry Jewel along track-like panels to reach new areas. In combat, each companion fights alongside Jewel and can be tasked with unleashing a special attack unique to that companion. These companions can also be improved by spending the fusion acquired from enemy cores, or by crafting parts for them from discovered blueprints. Blueprints and the parts needed to craft them can be found around the world, inside chests, dropping from enemies, or as rewards for completing hunting quests or side dungeons. The mechanic does add some depth to the game, but it ultimately comes across as a bit pointless. Jewel finds so many blueprints and parts that upgrading her companions often feels like a necessary chore rather than an enjoyable opportunity for customization. This is especially true because the loading times make returning to her base to craft them especially frustrating. Fortunately, finding the game's mini collectibles and exploring its dungeons is at times quite enjoyable. There are a number of areas, especially outdoors, that follow the very best platforming puzzle traditions. These areas force the player to figure out a route before often engaging in high-flying platforming using all the abilities at Jules' disposal to obtain the loot. These can be a real joy, but they're often the exception rather than the rule. More often than not, rare collectibles such as prismatic cores are simply protected by enemies in out-of-the-way places, or put into the relatively repetitive side dungeons. As for the handful of story dungeons, these are perfectly competent. Their design often leaves a lot to be desired. They take a cue from the puzzle dungeons of Zelda without ever reaching the intricate quality of that franchise. The puzzles are simple and mostly obvious, and the platforming quite straightforward, at least until the end of the game. With linear paths and only infrequent hidden goodies, you can blaze through most of these in little time. The visual design of these dungeons, like the rest of the game, is disappointing. One would expect that a game set in a desert world would make up for that drabness with spectacular dungeons and robotic enemies. Unfortunately, with occasional exceptions, this isn't the case, and the interiors are often as boring as the sands that swirl outside. The graphical fidelity also isn't as high as could be hoped, with poor textures and lots of popping. The game simply doesn't look as good as one would expect from a first-party title in this generation. Fortunately, the story does manage to stay just interesting enough to motivate players to push on. Told largely through discovered audio recordings, it recounts how a plague swept across Earth, and massive ships were sent to carry the escaping remnants of humanity to Far Eden. Robots using special intelligence cores would assist with the terraforming and construction of the new planet. But of course, as things often do with artificial intelligences, things go quickly wrong. There's not a lot of content to the story, but there's enough of a mystery that I wanted to see things through to the end. The plot moves along quickly during the first few hours, with Jewel uncovering more of the planet's secrets and meeting its few remaining inhabitants. However, towards the end, this slows down greatly with one of the most atrocious examples of padding I've seen in modern gaming. The final area consists of a 6-level dungeon, and each level must be unlocked by obtaining increasingly large numbers of prismatic cores. This forces you to retrace your steps and visit all the dungeons that previously appeared to be optional in order to complete the game. Worse, each of these final levels consists of nothing but a number of difficult platforming segments interrupted by frustrating arena battles. It's quite simply as if the developers ran out of ideas, but wanted to ensure the game took as long as possible to finish. Many were worried when Microsoft announced that the game would retail for around $40 USD, but the company assuaged concerns by saying the decrease in price was simply to better position a new IP in a competitive marketplace. As it stands, it appears that the price drop was absolutely a result of the amount of content. Without the padding, ReCore is a fairly short game, and much of this time already feels repetitive. There aren't any additional modes or options or even a difficulty setting. Ultimately, ReCore does nothing to innovate on the genre, and fails to offer a memorable experience. There are enjoyable moments here certainly, but nothing sets ReCore apart from the many excellent platformers against which it must be compared. The repetitive combat, poor visuals, thin story, and egregious loading times and length padding easily overshadow the occasional moments of high-flying fun or intense combat. Fortunately, gamers waiting for the next great console platform will just have to keep waiting.